Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining me today for this latest installment of my weekly teachings. Before we get started with today's teaching, a couple of reminders. First, if you'd like to stay connected to this channel for future teachings, click the subscribe button on the screen. Also, if you found value in this program, don't forget to give us a thumbs up. Now, if you scroll down to the description box below, that's where you'll find the links to all of my social media sites, as well as the link to my blog, My Daily Letters, where I post the prophetic words that I receive from the Lord. Well, now that we're finished with all of that, let's get started with today's teaching entitled, The Waiting is the Battlefield. I received this teaching 3 years ago in a dream. When I woke up, I wrote out what the Lord had shown me, which is this: that the waiting on God to move is in essence a battlefield. In part of the dream, I saw 2 hands grasping each other's forearms, bound together with a cord. This is significant because what I discovered just a few days ago is that in the Hebrew, the word waiting literally means to bind together. The Lord was showing me that when we stand in the space of waiting on Him to answer, this act of trust is the tangible expression of our agreement with His will. It's a pledge of partnership where we voice our belief that He will fulfill His promise no matter what. In the spiritual context, what defines waiting is fairly straightforward. It's having a confident expectation that God will act. In Micah 7, it says, "But as for me, I will watch expectantly for the Lord. I will wait for the God of my salvation. My God will hear me." When you and I come to the intersection of a dilemma where a decision has to be made, most of us usually barrel through with our own plans, presuming we know what we're supposed to do instead of pausing to ask the Lord for direction. But when we yield ourselves, halting our forward progression, and wait on God, we are literally giving His will the right of way. We're allowing Him to dictate our course. Think about it. Oftentimes, when we encounter a problem in our lives, and because our flesh tends to be impulsive and impatient, we look for an obvious solution so we can quickly settle the issue. And because we just want a quick fix so we can move on with our plans, we focus on the circumstance itself and tend to forget that most of the problems we encounter carry within them greater spiritual implications. Remember that God is working all things together for the good of those who love Him. When we consider how the Lord works, we'll find that at various times, He will allow adversity to develop around us as a means to bring about His good in our lives. He wants to, in effect, kill off the areas of partnership we still have with darkness in order to see His greater glory revealed in us. One of the ways He does this is by having us assume a stance of waiting. As believers, we know the many benefits of walking with God. But that doesn't mean we don't unwittingly allow demonic voices to continue speaking lies into our lives, which is why the scripture directs us to test all spirits. Thankfully, the Lord is not content to leave us as we are. So He presses down on enemy-occupied territory through the added pressure found in the space of waiting, using it as the device to create opportunities for breakthrough. He has us intentionally stand right in the middle of difficult situations in order to challenge and defeat those enemy strongholds still within us. We must be aware that we still battle against the evil that wants to keep us bound. As it says in Ephesians 6:12, Our struggle is not against flesh and blood, but against the rulers, against the authorities, against the powers of this dark world, and against the spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly realms. Think about it this way. After the Israelites crossed over the Jordan and entered the Promised Land, occupying that territory was not a walk in the park. They still had to drive the enemy out. The book of Joshua is a prototype of the spiritual battle we as believers are to wage. Just like the Israelites, we have to advance and contend against the enemy to possess our land of promise. But just like with Joshua, we're not to run headlong into battle. We must wait and ask the Lord for the correct strategies and the right timing. In the conquest of Jericho, Joshua sought the Lord first before launching a campaign against that enemy stronghold. The Lord had them wait 7 days before leveling an assault. And what happened? They easily overcame the enemy. It's important to learn how to allow the Lord to order our steps, because in our journey with Him, there are areas along the way where the path becomes extremely narrow, and one step out of alignment can add unwanted consequences, which is why we must rely on the Lord to tell us when and where to step. In Proverbs 16:9, it says, "We make our plans, but the Lord determines our steps." You and I don't know what's ahead of us on our pathway through this life, which the Lord has created for us to follow. But God does, because He's already been there. So when He tells us to wait, we must agree with His higher purposes and vision and wait. Some of you who know me personally are aware of the season of deeper faith which my husband and I have just come through. It took nearly 5 years where the Lord asked us to quit our jobs, empty our bank accounts, and sell or give away most of our possessions. During that season, we ended up living in a hotel for 2.5 years. And while there, our faith was challenged in ways we could not have imagined. Without a source of regular income, our lives were completely dependent on the Lord for provision. Now, one of the reasons that He had us step into this space was to deal with the spirit of fear that I had partnered with for most of my adult life. One particular week, we had several issues come to a head. Our car was on the verge of repossession, and one of the hotel staff then had mistakenly overdrawn our bank account by hundreds of dollars. Then we both got sick and were quarantined. Our hands felt as if they had been tied behind our backs, and there was nothing we could do in and of ourselves to resolve the situation. And I heard the Lord say, "I've placed you in a quagmire." Now, as the pressure continued to build, the hotel and the bank which held our car loan both gave us a looming deadline to pay or quit. As you might imagine, it was very difficult not to say enough and throw in the towel. But we heard from the Lord telling us to stand in faith and wait on Him. We battled against fear, stood on the truth of God, and worshiped continuously as we waited. The Lord would often remind me of this verse in Deuteronomy 31. "Be strong and courageous. Do not be afraid or terrified because of them. For the Lord your God goes with you. He will never leave you nor forsake you." The quagmire entered week 2 when on the final Sunday while we were worshiping, I literally felt the spiritual oppression break. Now that next morning, we had arrived at the deadline imposed by the hotel and the bank. We hadn't any money to pay either of them, but the Lord in that moment showed us what walking in His favor looked like, as both the hotel and the bank gave us an extension to the following day. As we continued to stand and wait, that same afternoon, the Lord told us to take a victory lap and to prepare to receive good news. About an hour later, a couple we knew called to tell us that they'd been praying for us. They said the Lord showed them in a vision to bless us financially. It was more than enough to get us caught up and cover our needs. We literally wept in relief. Now, when I received this teaching, the Lord highlighted 4 points to ponder. First, waiting is a stance of warfare. Now, what I mean by this is to say that waiting is not about being passive, but we're to actively pursue the enemy. However, it's imperative not to advance until or unless the Lord gives the order. For me, the fear of man was, so to speak, a giant in my land. So much so that the prospect of confronting the hotel manager terrified me. Then when the deadlines arrived and the money hadn't, it wasn't just that we couldn't pay our bill, but that we had no definitive answer to give about when the funds would arrive. What were we going to say, that the check's in the mail? At that point, we were looking for the physical victory. But the Lord's plan was to bring the spiritual victory first. So instead of letting the hotel manager contact us, the Lord sent us down to the front desk for a face-to-face with him. In that moment, God was providing the space for me to overcome that giant named fear by going on the offensive instead of hiding in my room. In Psalms 118, it says, "Out of my distress, I called on the Lord. The Lord answered me and set me free. The Lord is on my side. I will not fear. What can man do to me?" Now, let me clarify my point by saying this, that when we were in that space of waiting, the Lord did ask us at one point to sit on our hands, meaning not to do anything in the physical sense. We were only to seek his presence and then wait on his instructions, like when he said, take a victory lap or talk to the manager. However, this was never done of our own volition. We allowed the Lord to set the rules of engagement. Second, waiting draws the enemy out into the open. As I mentioned, one of the reasons he had us step into this space was not only to enlarge our faith, but to deal with my partnership with fear. Now, as the outside pressure of the quagmire mounted, the enemy challenged my position of waiting with declarations of a negative outcome, trying to get me to move. But when I resisted, he came at me even harder, trying to stir up anxiety so that I would give up on God. He would say things to me like that God won't come through, or you're going to wind up out on the street, or even, what will people think? But through that battle of overcoming fear, I learned to discern if a lie was present, as it contradicted the truth found in God. One of the promises we would stand on was in Exodus 14. The Lord will fight for you. You need only be still. So I would press back against the enemy's lies with that truth. I remember this specific point where the battle line shifted, where I had set my face like flint and hadn't budged, and the enemy's attacks became more blatant. My stance of waiting had drawn him out. In an instant, I was able to recognize what the voice of fear sounded like. And I remember saying to him, "Caught you, I caught you." I learned that when a thought would spring up about our situation that didn't line up with what the Lord was saying about my future, I knew it was the enemy. Now, one thing to remember is this. When it is the enemy pushing us to act, anxiety is usually present, as he often uses fearful thoughts as a motivator in an attempt to get us to partner with his lies instead of God's will. The Bible tells us that fear is not from the Lord. It says in 2 Timothy 1:7 that God did not give us a spirit of fear, but of power, love, and self-control. This knowledge alone can aid us tremendously in overcoming the enemy. Third, God isn't bound by our deadlines. Regardless of what people say, God's will supersedes the demands of man. We were up against hard deadlines where it looked like if God didn't come through, we would not only be out on the street, but lose our car as well. But because the Lord was not only working on us, but on others who shared in our circumstances, he let deadlines come and go without acting, knowing his perfect timing hadn't yet arrived. We held on, enduring adversity while waiting for the Lord to finally act, which he did, but not until he accomplished in us all that he had intended. The story of Lazarus holds this key. Recall that Mary and Martha were close friends of Jesus. When their brother Lazarus fell ill, the sisters sent word to Jesus asking him to come to them, hoping that Jesus would heal their brother. Instead of rushing to their aid, Jesus purposely delayed his departure for a few days. When he finally did arrive, his friend Lazarus was now 4 days in the grave. An ancient Jewish belief says that when someone's died, their soul would hover over the body for 3 days after death before returning to God. So in the minds of Mary and Martha, Lazarus was definitely dead, as the traditional deadline set for the miraculous had come and gone. But as we know, Jesus had the gravestone rolled away and then raised Lazarus from the dead. He was proving to everyone that he was not held to the boundaries or timelines of man. Did I eventually overcome the spirit of fear? Yes. But both my husband and I also learned about God's keeping power, where he showed us his ability to maintain our lives regardless of what man or the enemy had to say about it. Fourth, obedience is key. In our journey with the Lord, he will often ask us to step into difficult places and or say things to us that are difficult for us to hear. But that should not deter us from following after him. When the Lord said to me that he had placed us in a quagmire, I wasn't quite sure I knew what that really meant, but I knew it didn't sound good. This definitely wasn't what we wanted to hear, but having previously walked through some pretty intense battles earlier in that season, we understood that the Lord wasn't as concerned about our momentary discomfort as he was with our spiritual growth and maturity. In 2 Corinthians 4:17, it says, "For our light and momentary affliction is producing for us an eternal weight of glory that is far beyond comparison. So we fix our eyes not on what is seen, but on what is unseen. For what is seen is temporary, but what is unseen is eternal." Know this, that there are moments where he asks us to stand in a hard place in order to move us to decide whether or not we are going to continue to follow him, regardless of what that looks like or costs us. The end of chapter 6 of the book of John focuses on what happened with the crowd after the feeding of the 5,000. It says that as the disciples and Jesus depart, the crowd hangs around waiting for them to return. But when they don't, the crowd sets out after them, not because they wanted to hear more from Jesus, but because they wanted free food. This is where Jesus shakes the dead fruit from the vine by telling those present that whoever wanted to be a true disciple had to eat his flesh and drink his blood. A difficult word, to say the least. It was a challenge that was too much for some of his disciples, as it says in verse 66. From this time, many of his disciples turned back and no longer followed him. But consider the disciples who stayed. Was this word any less difficult for them to hear? The disciples who departed liked the idea of following Jesus, but not the part that was necessary to be a true disciple. This teaches us that in reality, obtaining our promised destiny has a cost. In our thoughts, we may be following the Lord, but God requires steps of obedience that flow from a willing heart. We are always given the choice to stay the course or walk away. At any time during that quagmire, my husband and I could have told the Lord we've had enough and given up. But we knew that going through that struggle was necessary to seeing the future the Lord had promised come to pass. And that meant the stronghold of fear had to be broken off. Blessing and breakthrough were the rewards for staying the course and obediently waiting on the Lord. But it wasn't just financial blessing. It was a deeper intimacy with the Lord that was created as we ran hard after his presence. We learned through trial that stepping out onto that battlefield of waiting always includes so much more the Lord wants to give us than simply the resolution to the problem. So for those of you who are in a place of waiting for your answer to come, instead of approaching your circumstance with discouragement or entertaining the lies of doubt, let me encourage you to see this moment for what it is: a spiritual battlefield where you can reclaim the ground the enemy has been occupying in your life by facing it with the strength of a confident expectation that God is going to act. Thank you again for joining me today.